Kimberly Brouillette. We are here for Virtual Fantasycon 2015. I have a group of authors with me, and we're going to be talking about backstory today and how to utilize it with regard to your characters. I have a nice array of authors, and I think we're all excited about participating. I would like to, first of all, introduce myself. I'm Kimberly Brouillette. I have written 2 books already, and I'm working on my 3rd, Secrets in the Shallows and Devil in the Details. They are paranormal murder mysteries, kind of like a cross between Agatha Christie and Alfred Hitchcock. So they are true mystery whodunits. And if you would like to find out more information about me, you can go to www.kimberlybrouillette.com, as well as you can find me on Goodreads and Facebook. And if you have if you have a Twitter account, you can follow me at Write for You, WRITE.RIGHT, the number 4, the letter U, on Twitter. And go ahead, Kate Spivey, if you would introduce yourself, please.
Yes, and points for pronouncing my last name correctly. That doesn't happen very often.
Oh, good.
But yeah,
my last name.
Yeah. I'm Kate Spivey. I'm a freelance editor and a dark fantasy and horror author. I have 3 horror e-novellas out right now. I See the Web, A Single Thread, and The Ties Eternal. And the first 2 of those are available in paperback as The First Web. My high fantasy novel, From Under the Mountain, is being released this January from Roots Publications. That's a dark fantasy. And my writing it's dark, obviously. I like to explore unexpected connections between characters, usually between the good characters and the bad characters, as well as the rules and repercussions of magic as a power source and as something that they interact with. And I'm also a queer author, so my goal is to diversify my favorite genres. I'm really active on Twitter and Facebook, and those are just at my name, at Kate Spivey, or Kate Spivey on Facebook. And you can get all my news there, as well as through my website, katespivey.com. That's C-A-I-T as in Tango, S-P as in Papa, I-V as in Victor, E-Y. It gets misspelled a lot too. I live in the American Northwest with my husband and my dog, and when I'm not writing, I'm sketching or planning my next tattoo.
So, and I'm in Charlotte, North Carolina. So we have a lot of people on these panels from all over the world. Actually, we have a Canadian, we have an Australian. Not necessarily in this panel. Mm-hmm. I just think it's really neat to be able to get together from all over. Now. Yeah. Jeffrey, where are you at? And can you introduce yourself?
I certainly can. My name is Jeffrey Cook. I'm really probably not all that far from Kate. I'm right near Seattle, Washington.
I'm in Portland.
Oh, yeah. Okay. I was just down in Portland not long ago. I am the author of 6 books with number 7 coming soon. My first book, or first series, was the Dawn of Steam trilogy, which is epistolary format steampunk, so all letters and journal entries in that Mary Shelley or Jane Austen style in the Regency era.
Yeah.
After most recently, I've kind of moved to young adult. Most recent young adult release is Foul is Fair, the first book of what will be a 4-book urban fantasy series set in Seattle. From kind of a buddy story between 2 teenage girls here. Also have previously done young adult science fiction, traditionally published through Fire and Ice, young adult out of Minnesota, and that's Mina Cortez from Bouquets to Bullets, which is kind of a buddy story mystery, again, female-fronted. And then the other feature I wanted to do here, I am one of the authors for and the head organizer of the Writer Punk Project, which our first publication is out. The second one will be out in December. And this is 5 different authors from around the world doing science fiction adaptations of Shakespeare plays to kind of help get each other's names out there but also benefiting Paws Animal Rescue and Shelter in Linwood, Washington here. We just took our first check to Paws a week ago, fully funding a big dog kennel for a year.
Awesome. Great.
Partially in the name of one of my former rescue dogs. We've got 3 rescue dogs here, so it's a cause I'm fairly passionate about. But the first one is Sound and Fury, and in December we'll be releasing Once More Into the Breach, Shakespeare Goes Punk Volume 2.
Nice.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
And you're working with Catherine on that project, right?
She is one of the authors and as well as one of the editors with the Writer Punk project. Yes.
Now, Kenya, can you introduce yourself and also let you know that you're only like 30 minutes away?
That's right. Hi, I'm Kenya Moore, but I go by the pen name K.N. Lee. And like Kimberly said, I live in North Carolina, Charlotte, North Carolina. And I am the author of the Chronicles of Koa series. I have the first book, The Chronicles of Koa Netherworld, and we have the second book, Dark Prophet. Libranian Blade will be out in January. It's a 4-book series. It's urban fantasy set in London. It's set in London, and it circles around a half-blood vampire and an organization that is much like the CIA, but they're headed by angels that protect humans from supernatural creatures.
Excellent.
And, thank you. And I also love swords and sorcery. So I have my high fantasy novel, Rise of the Flame. I started this novel when I was 11 years old, and finally,
Wow.
and finally got it published. It's a 3-book series that's set in a world that's it's 6 races, 4 realms, and 1 human girl that can bring them together in peace or war. And I'm also the author of 1 romance novella called Liquid Lust. It's part of a multi-author project called The Club, where each book is centered around the same fictional town of Coram, Texas, where there's a mysterious club that everyone goes to.
Nice.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, those are so much fun. I have another one coming out November 15th. It's Woodland Creek. My book is called The Scarlet Legacy, and the same concept. Each author's books are set in this fictional town of Woodland Creek, Indiana, where there are shifters, wizards, and humans. So I'm looking forward to that. Goddess of War is another epic fantasy that I have coming out November 2nd. And other than that,
Someone's busy.
yes. I'm with,
And had a baby.
and I just had a baby in July. Yeah, other than that, I have 3 poetry books. Poetry is very important to me. One paranormal horror collection called Thicker Than Blood. That's on Amazon as well. And 1 fantasy collection called A Gifted Curse. You can find me on my website, KNLee, that's LEE.com, on Facebook, Twitter at K Nicole Lee. My Nicole is spelled with a Y, so it's NYCOLE. And of course, you can find me on Goodreads and Pinterest, Instagram.
Everywhere.
Well, good to see you all.
Wonderful. Thank you all for joining me on this. I think it's going to be a lot of fun. We had a great time on the first panel too. So now this one is focusing on backstory. So the first question, basically everybody will have about 3 minutes to talk about these, and then I'll introduce you to begin your answers. The first question is, why do you think that utilizing a creative backstory is an important writing tool in developing your characters? And for the authors, which we only have here, how have you used this in your own books, and give examples? So as, again, I'm Kimberly Brouillette, and I do have both of my books have been focused very heavily on backstory. In fact, there's a whole bunch of backstory that I had to create in order for this story to work at all. And when I had a co-author for the first book, she had not really thought out any backstory. And when I first started with her on the project, she actually had a dream, which basically spawned this series. And her dream is the prologue of the book, and it's this murder that takes place. Well, when she came to me actually initially, and she wanted me to edit something that she had written, I started reading. I was like, we need to look at backstory. Have you thought about motivation? Have you thought about why this person is doing these crazy things? And she was like, well, no, I haven't really thought about that. And I'm like, well, that's very important, because you have to know the motivation of why they're doing that in order to put out the story. I take it, Kate, you run into this situation probably.
As an editor, all the time.
All the time. Okay,
all the time.
So you understand. So she came to me, and I loved the premise of the story, though. And so I told her, I said, I have a bunch of great ideas. I said, but the story you have, what you have right at that point, it wasn't a realistic story. There wasn't a lot of realistic evidence. And so I basically said, why don't we, what do you think about these ideas? And so she liked what I had brought to the table. And so we worked on it jointly. And so we basically totally revamped everything that she had worked on previously, because the story it changed. We needed, because the motivation, there wasn't any real motivation before. So now we came up with this entire backstory that would allow this mystery to have a purpose, and say why these people, why this person is the way they are, why they're so crazy, and why this person is even doing this in the first place. So backstory is so critical. And as far as with regard to this story, I can't really get into too much, because the entire third book, which the first two books I've used to basically get the main story out and the current part. Basically, the first one is about the mysteries themselves, the murders, and getting into the characters. So it's the what. The second book, you actually don't find out who did it until the end of the second book. So the end of the second book is the who. And you get into a little bit as to the reason why they are doing this. The third one is actually going to be the entire backstory, and that one's going to be called Method and the Madness. And so with the third story, it's basically going to start from the very beginning, and it's going to tie everything together. And so that, you will understand why this person is the way they are. It just brings, it brings that whole story, and it just puts it in a nice package, because the person understands what this person is thinking, why they're feeling the way they do. It just gives purpose to everything. Some examples, for instance, with regard to that, is that there were things that took place like 30 years ago. Well, people haven't even really heard about a lot of those things, but those things are critical. And they are going to be brought out even more in the third book as to why everybody's doing that. So go ahead and, Kate, would you give some examples of what you've done and why you think this is so important?
Yeah, I mean, obviously you already touched on a lot of it. Backstory is what makes characters from like sketches on a page into real people, and as a writer, that the more real they are, the more reasonably you can write their actions. And like I said, as an editor, I see it all the time where these characters, they don't seem to be grounded in any history beyond page one. And it makes it really, really hard to have a handle on what their goals are, what their values are, even how past experiences interact with what's happening in the plot, and how that informs the decisions characters make. The backstory is so important that way. For not just your main characters, but your secondary characters as well. And aside from the sheer logistics of it, it just, knowing that well gives the depth to your manuscript and adds those layers that make the reading experience really rich. And if you know your backstory well, then, that kind of thing can flow into the scenes really organically, I think. as far as my own books, my horror novellas are essentially standalone backstory. I refer to them as origin stories for the characters that will be in novels coming out in the next few years. And each one starts with a character that has their baseline experience, and then the novella is like the next step in their history. As an example, Miranda, who's the main character of The Ties Eternal, is deaf and Latina, but she's also able to communicate with ghosts. And her only experiences with the ghosts have been frightening and disgusting. But her life as a deaf Mexican-American girl has given her very clear, strong ideas about how people should be treated. And so when a particular ghost changes the dynamic and asks her to help stop a murderer, her experiences of stigma and oppression overcome her fear of ghosts so that she can enact justice in this case. And without knowing the whole experience of her life really thoroughly, it would have been really difficult to make that shift come across as plausible. And in From Under the Mountain, which is a high fantasy, we have 4,000 years worth of backstory to contend with between humans and witches and gods, and it culminates in a situation where the main character, Gwerlyn, becomes the factor that makes yet another confrontation between two gods into the final one over this book and its sequel. And Gwerlyn's life experience, despite being a princess, her life has been one of isolation and petty abuse, where her family always treated her as expendable. She's, second daughter, and she wasn't a witch. She was basically worthless. And when they all die and she ends up becoming empress, she sort of second guesses her self-sufficiency in the face of all her new advisors and all the new expectations. And that's how she ends up getting caught in a web of magical manipulation that she has to then find her way out of. Mm-hmm. So all of backstory, really crucial to my books.
Oh, yes. Now, are you finished with yours before I move on to, I guess it's...
The end.
I agree with you on all that. The other aspect somebody brought out last time was medical too. Things that might affect your decisions, or influences that might affect your decisions, can also be part of, in addition to emotional, like you were talking about.
Yeah.
Life circumstances. You have so many different things that can affect how you act. And that can be everything from taking a medication to, whether you're an orphan. Mm-hmm. Everything. Okay, Jeffrey, what about you?
Okay, so one of the things that I really liked that Kate touched on briefly was not just backstory for characters, but backstory for the world, and mm-hmm. how that shaped the characters. And just from the perspective of my own first series, I'll touch on that with the Dawn of Steam novels. They are being related as historical documents. A widow collecting her husband's letters, journal entries, those of other things relating. And so for her, all of the story is backstory. It has shaped who she is, her experiences, how that has shaped the world. And you're seeing, decades and decades and the influence of the previous story and how it has moved into more typical Victorian steampunk from the Regency era, which is much closer to our own world. Then as far as the characters go, not just, how it shapes them, but how they perceive each other, how they interact. Because in the books, the Napoleonic Wars have just ended, and how the primary narrator perceives the other characters is largely colored by that history. James Coltrane, the owner of the Dame Fortuna, the airship that they'll be traveling in, is important or known to the narrator only because he's the greatest war hero of his era. That shapes all of how people perceive him, as well as his own experiences, and the story wouldn't happen without that backstory. Mm-hmm. So it not only helps motivate the characters, it pushes the story along. And the same thing as far as motivations, your villains need backstory. You need, villains frequently are what drive the plot or, set up your story. So it's support characters, it's villains, it's your primary characters, it's who they interact with, all need kind of that backstory because it shapes both motivations and who they are, but also how they interact with each other, what they know about each other. To touch on another book, and for even greater contrast, in Foul is Fair, I have a 16-year-old girl where she has ADHD. Her mother also has severe obsessive issues, and that relationship drives a lot of the motivation, shapes a lot of the characters. But as a 16-year-old teenager, she only has, so much history. So she's interacting with this kind of fairy world she's pushed into and forced to interact with very differently as it's new, whereas some of the other characters, like her best friend Lani Kahale, has interacted with this world, has seen it, is familiar with it. So that shapes those reactions. And then all of that is contrasted with the fairies, some of whom are 2,000-year-old beings who have a totally alien perspective. So the contrast there is important. And then lastly, like in Mina Cortez, and talking about shaping supporting characters, the kind of sidekick character, Miko Kimura, it's very important that to her backstory and how she interacts with things and secondary plot lines, that her mother died not all that long ago, and it drove a wedge into what had been a very close relationship between her and her father. So that is now shaping her motivations, how she's interacting. And in turn, that will occasionally pull the main character or pull the story in directions. So when you're looking at the interactions, everybody's story, can give you ideas, can give you directions, can move the plot along. So that's why it's important to me, is it really shapes everything I'm doing.
I think you're absolutely on point. The the other thing that you can do is just simply setting a scene. Getting at the very beginning of my prologue, I wanted people to get a sense for what the surroundings were like and what that little town was like, and and you hear the buoys, dinging in the distance, and you hear the storm coming in, and you have this.
Heads up, there's a train coming.
Yeah, I hear it. You have trains coming,
Sorry. I told Amtrak not to send any trains through this time.
We'll pause for just a minute.
It should be, they're going pretty fast here. Sometimes they crawl through at such a slow pace.
Okay. I can edit this out.
Good time to pause, because the dogs are also real interested in something outside.
Oh.
So while we're paused, Kate, are you going to be at Oricon?
I was going to, I was trying to, well, I don't really know. I was trying to message people to see about getting involved with the workshops, but nobody was answering my emails, and I don't know if I could make it now because of my schedule.
Right.
So, I don't know. We'll see. I might try to go for like one day. Are you?
Okay. Yeah, I will be running the NIWA, the Northwest Independent Writers Association table.
Oh, okay, cool.
So I will be there, and I'll be one of the authors in the anthology, so signing up at the NIWA room party and stuff. So I'll be there all weekend.
Awesome. Well, I'll let you know if I'm going to plan on going one day.
Cool.
I think it's really important to bring out, like Jeffrey said, the surroundings, and you have these fantasy worlds in some cases, or you have these normal situations, or what appears to be normal, today situations, locations, but you also have maybe some mystical ones or some fantasy ones, so you need to establish all that and give the reader a feeling, of course, for the backstory of the setting as well. In my case, it's a little town, and it's a fictional town in Maine. Not, one that everybody's asked me, is it a real town? No, it's not. I purposely did not want a real town because I didn't want somebody saying, well, that's not the way it is, so, but, having at the beginning, I had the storm rolling in, and I had the lobster boats rocking back and forth in the water, and I had these, bells ringing in the lighthouse, turning and things like that. So you have a good sense of where you're at from the very beginning. and it links to the story.
Mhm.
So, okay, then as well, Kenya. So if you can give us some examples from what you do.
Okay, yeah, I think backstory is pretty important, especially for my books. In Rise of the Flame, my epic fantasy, I created an entire world, so I had to, it's kind of important to kind of understand how this world came about. In Rise of the Flame, all of my gods come from different universes. So when they came together to kind of experiment with making one world together, my book starts off with how that experiment went wrong. So they all have, each god has a race, whether it's humans, silver elves, shadow elves, Trians, which is a race that I created, fairies, or one of those things. The experiment went wrong with all of these being together. So they created boundaries that separated them into their own realms. So in Rise of the Flame, one of the gods destroys these boundaries to try to kill off all of the other races. So when my girl Lyle comes in as the human that is, supposed to either bring them back together or, help make the humans be the alpha race, I think it's important to know how that all happened and why she's so important. So, yeah, so that's why backstory is important for that book. And same thing for the Chronicles of Koa. In the Chronicles of Koa, she actually loses a good bit of her memories from her time as a young child and teenager in the Netherworld, which is where all of the supernatural creatures come from. So to have her go back to the Netherworld and discover, her relationship with the person that cursed her mother, or, how the angels separated all the supernatural creatures from the humans, I think it's pretty important to understand these things so you know why she's motivated to, to do her job and protect the humans from these creatures.
What are one of the second questions, it says, what are some unique ways or writing methods to make characters stand out by using backstory? Be specific in discussing this. And authors give examples, can be from your books or books that you've read. So in regard to that, and one of the things that we talked about before was writing methods can include dialogue. So, depending on the region that you're from, you're going to speak differently than you would from other regions. And so sometimes it does pay to do a little bit of research if you aren't familiar with a certain area, because they may say things differently. Obviously, I'm in North Carolina. I use y'all. They don't do that in New York, So they might do it in Texas, but they don't do it in New York. So, those are important things, is dialogue, obviously. So, pay attention, and sometimes it might be worth it. One of the things that I've done, and I think that is really interesting, Chris, my fiance, is an actor, and he's been on a lot of, he does like 300 voices, so he's helpful when it comes to audiobooks and things like that. But I've been able to learn some of the things through his acting methods. And, somewhat, one of Michelle on the previous panel brought up the fact that she likes to bring out the 20 questions to characters, and what brings out that person, how that person would act in certain situations, or how would they answer certain things in their life. And so that allows you to bring that backstory to life, because, were they an orphan? Did they grow up in a great family? All those things can affect the decisions that they make now. And so, one of the things she brought out in the previous discussion was doing 20 questions with your characters, and say, what would they do in this situation? How would they act? All these things. I thought that was a great suggestion. With regard to Chris, he actually gets into character, and he says, and this is kind of what I do a lot of times, what would this character think? You try to get in their mindset, and based on their backstory, and what would be realistic for them. So And also, using the correct dialogue, based on their geography, and also, the type of person they are. Somebody that's from the ghetto is not going to speak like someone that's, high society. So all those things come into play. One of the things that, as far as my sheriff, and I brought out in the last panel, is that my sheriff is not the most couth guy. And so he's got this, kind of Carol O'Connor kind of person, and he's sitting there, and he's not really the nicest, guy as far as manners. And so he's sitting there eating a sandwich with his mouth full, and he's, he's speaking with his mouth full, and he's sitting there, and he's, I'm able to use the dialogue to show how uncouth he is, because he's sitting there talking like this, with his mouth full, and so the way that the words are spelled are the way that he would sound, but it's that all that character comes out, and it makes them, the fact that they aren't such a couth character, why that person is like that is a good, I guess, you think about and get into that mindset so that you know how the person is going to act. Sorry.
No, it's okay. Yeah, I totally second everything that you just said. The details are super important. The context of like where they grew up. I spent most of I honed most of my personal writing in like play-by-post role-playing games. So for that, you always had to do a character profile so that everybody else on the site knew what your character was about. And so, I do like a 4 or 5 paragraph backstory for each character, and it really, really was so helpful. Some people did like 10 pages of personality description, and I'm like, that's not helpful as much as knowing where they came from. Mm-hmm. Like, you can describe a person's personality till the cows come home, but characters are really just the sum of their experiences. Mm-hmm. So I like to start with actual history, where they were born, who their parents were, what their education was like, and it's for those reasons that you laid out. When I approach putting backstory into a manuscript, I tend to think that most of it, the details explicitly, will probably never see the light of day, because I think it's more for the writer, so that they can do their job better, which is making a character that people can relate to. Or who feels real to the reader. So I tend to think that it manifests in the actual manuscript in 2 major ways, aside from the details like the mouth eating.
That was fun. I just imagine this chair so.
Yeah, no, that's a great example. But yeah, so 2 ways. The first and the most explicit way is in terms of like memories, because I don't know about you guys, but I constantly am reminded of stuff when I am like living my daily life, and characters have the same thing going on, So there's a scene in From Under the Mountain, my high fantasy, where the main character Gwerlyn finds her lover Eva crying. So there's a paragraph after that where Gwerlyn remembers that she's only seen Eva cry twice before, and she recalls each of those instances in about a sentence each. And sometimes the memory doesn't have to be explicitly stated. It can just be like hinted at, like she's been here before, or she's seen this before, or something like that, and it can be super cryptic. It's just something to remind the reader that the character had a life before page 1. And the second way that I think backstory manifests a lot is just in the character's goals for each scene. You guys were talking about motivations earlier, and this is just my take on that. I think characters have, they have overall goals for the whole book. They've got goals in each scene, and not only that, they've got layers of goals for the whole book and each scene. And character development comes in how those goals shift and change and reprioritize based on what they're dealing with in the book. And, so they have to start with a set of goals, and those goals are based on where they came from before page 1. And how they react to challenges to their goals is going to depend on what their life has been before
Yes.
So that's
the word.
Yeah. I gave a workshop on this last year, so
yeah. It's fun though. I love that stuff, you know.
Yeah.
And it also, the other thing about character sheets that you mentioned, obviously that's, you know, a great point to bring out. They do help so much when you're actually in the process of writing, because you can't necessarily remember every little detail about every character that you create. And
yes,
so
yeah.
they have blonde hair and blue eyes, or they're African American, or if they're Latino, or whatever, you know, you might have those ideas, but you might not remember specifics. I have this 5'3" Asian guy that's, you know, a forensics, and, you know, so I have fun with him because of his, you know, short. I'm 4'11", so I can speak. I'm technically a dwarf. And so, you know, I can relate to him in the sense that, you know, he has to hop through the snow, you know, and using also the scenery, you know, the backstory of the scenery to propel even some comedy, you know, sometimes, or other things. Because I'm sit there and I've got him, you know, basically he's got all this forensic equipment, and they just had this massive snow, and he's 5'3", and so he's had this like 12-inch snow, and all his friends are laughing at him.
Yeah, and that's the other thing I like about doing the histories is that you end up with a cast of characters that you can pull into the novel later, like maybe their childhood best friend comes back or is the murderer or something. Like you can leverage those relationships.
But those character sheets can come in big and very handy, and trying to remember little details, you know, that you might want to pull out later. You might not have thought you would pull it out, but it can be handy later.
Exactly. I call mine a character morgue. I have a sheet for every character.
Yeah. Okay, so Jeffrey, what about you?
Well, first, just kind of finding it interesting. Long-time role-playing gamer. I still do some work in the tabletop RPG industry, so I still do character sheets. I also do play-by-post gaming.
Yeah, I'm just getting into tabletop. I was forum-based before.
I've been tabletop gaming since I was 8 years old. So definitely a part of my history. So I do the detailed character sheets and character backstories, and once that's there, then usually my editor and now co-writer and I will do some voice testing and kicking voices back and forth. But, you know, since that ground has kind of been covered, the other thing I'll go into is I'm a really, really intensive researcher. Particularly starting with Dawn of Steam, because a lot of that is almost, you know, backstory or potential backstory for a lot of other steampunk novels in the Victorian, but is starting from something much closer to the actual Regency era. So I was going through and trying to figure out, how did people speak? How did people write? Different cultures, what events, what people, what was the atmosphere that affected those characters? Different from now. So it's set, part of the point is it's set very much in this world, but a lot of the things and people would be very kind of alien to modern people. And also had all of my, everything I was doing being fact-checked by somebody with a master's degree in history, specialty in British imperialism. So I had to get my details right for the events, for, okay, this level of education will write like this level of education will write like this. Since I'm doing it all in letters and journal entries, to get character voices across that education and that backstory, and the difference between, you know, an Oxford education and, okay, some, you know, writing lessons secondhand will be completely different for getting those voices and characterization across. And same thing, the highly educated socialite versus the highly educated soldier. Same school system, but they express themselves very differently. And even down to, you know, character voices. Probably the most intensive research for those books went into getting the voice for Sambo right, even though she only has a few lines of dialogue that are cited. But English is not necessarily her first language, or even her second or third or fourth. And she's been off on the frontier speaking mostly with Native Americans. She's been all over the world, known and unknown as of that period. So to get that voice right, I was looking into the people I know who are very, very multilingual, and others, and having that very, very precise speech where she's totally fluent. She's not struggling over the words, but everything is elongated a little bit, and everything is very, very ends up very precise, even as a fairly casual character. And then the same thing, applied to some of the other books to get Megan O'Reilly's voice right in the Fairfolk Chronicles. We interviewed a number of people with ADHD who have been over-medicated, under-medicated. What's their perspective? How do they see things when they're on this level of medication? While trying to get some of the different details and sensory information in, so it's really getting things from her perspective, which is not one I'm immediately familiar with. And, but I feel that that's really important, since a lot of my writing kind of reflects, Seattle and its very diverse culture. So when writing somebody with a disability, when writing somebody from a different culture, those details are very important to get right, especially writing, from outside of that culture, which I guess kind of hit me after living for a while on a Blackfoot reservation, on being, really, really totally immersed in that culture for several months in a row, and seeing the differences there and difference in perspective, and totally living in that world. So now it's very important for me to do my research to get the characters right, especially when they have experiences I don't share.
I agree on that. One of the things, one of the authors that I think that is really good at doing that is Diana Gabaldon. She's the one that wrote the series, and she actually uses 5 languages in her books. And that she actually did the research where she went back and she did a study of the actual dialects that were used 200 years ago. So it's, that was, she actually speaks in those languages in the books themselves. And for a while she will translate, but then you get into the story and then she expects she'd already, she's already told you once, So, but she has done a tremendous amount of that sort of research where she has gone through and she's studied what the culture was like during that time, even the dialects they use, the languages they use, and how different, even social situations, obviously that can play into that significantly. So social situations between a man and woman 200 years ago are completely different.
Totally different.
And so, she did a tremendous amount of research. And then she also began the story in the 40s during the war era. The war had just ended. So there again is another culture set that she basically used that to launch her story before her character goes back in time. So, so she actually kind of did, multi research when it came to that. Okay, so now, Kenya, would you tell some examples from your, and some things that you, writing methods that you used?
So the methods that I've used, I actually got the inspiration for the Chronicles of Koa when I was living in Korea. And I decided to make her be like the first Korean superhero. And I think it was really important, my experience there, to put that into the book, because her backstory starts off as, in poverty. She may be wealthy now, but she lived in poverty with her mother for a long time. So I think it was important to, put that in there through her interactions with other wealthy people, and how she how she values things, values the little things and values relationships over material things, because she, lived without those things for so long. So I do put that in there with dialogue and from her memories, and, also from dreams. I use dreams sometimes because I get a lot of inspiration from dreams. So my characters do as well. And I was really interested in what Kate and Jeffrey mentioned about the role-playing games, because I do that as well. So I found it very interesting that 3 people on this panel are all RPG.
It's not a coincidence, I know.
Yeah.
It definitely helps develop the love of story. So
Absolutely. I see that it's a huge help for creating characters. When I wrote my first draft of Rise of the Flame, my editor recommended that I do a style sheet because I have so many different races. They all have their own, traits and abilities that it's just, wise to keep track of those things. And I put those in my book as well so that people can go back and kind of, take a look and see what the different races do and, where they're from. And I make sure I have a map and stuff like that. So, yeah, that's I pretty much, second what everyone said, all great answers.
I know that Chris, my fiance, he was the one that was doing all the role-playing games. I really haven't had time. But I've wanted to find time now. I want to get involved with them, but I just haven't. I literally have not had the time. This week, has been a good example. So, again, I apologize that I wasn't able to get the questions to everybody sooner.
There you go.
But as far as the other question, the third one is this. This, of course, will determine if you're an author or blogger. So since we are all authors, I guess we all have the same question. Based on your own learning experiences, what advice would you give other authors about using backstory in their books? Give examples to explain. So with regard to mine is that is probably allowing that, like what we've been basically talking about, doing that research. That's probably the biggest help, because if you know what those people are about, one of the things that I had to do, you're talking about situations, I've never been arrested, knock on wood. I don't plan on being. One of my characters was, and so I had to, of course, I did 2 weeks worth of research on being arrested, believe it or not, before I wrote about it. It's a lot harder to write about than just talking about. Because I wanted people to empathize with one of my main characters. I wanted them to empathize with what she's going through, and she's this older woman, and she has never been in this situation before, and she's been arrested, and she's a nun, and so she's Mother Superior, and you would have never thought this woman would have ever been arrested, but she finds herself in this situation. And so I want the reader to have the empathy, and so I go through every single step of the process so that they can see her reaction through that. But that required research. And it was the same thing when I have to admit, in my first book, I didn't do quite as much on the legal research. So for those, I did go back and do a lot more in the second one, because there wasn't as much involved in the first book, but there was a little bit more in the second. And I actually spent another 2 weeks doing research on that before I started writing about it. So legal is a whole new aspect that you can run into. What are the appropriate words? What do they say? What do they do? When do they do it? Especially in the courtroom, it's really gets. Those are not my favorite scenes to write, to be honest, because they're so methodical and blah 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 blah. They got to be a certain way, and but you do have to do that sometimes. Maybe you have to write about things that you don't like, and by doing that research, it helps you get through that. So I think that's probably my biggest advice when it comes to that. Is do your research. Like, do your homework.
Yeah, exactly.
So, Kate, go ahead. What's your advice?
Well, I tried to break it down in a couple of sound bites. We'll see how that goes. First, like I said earlier, I think that backstory is primarily for the author. Like, it's you, so that you can treat these characters the way that they deserve to be treated, whether that's good or bad for them. But yeah, so it's more for you. It should end up in the story, but, and this is the second point, backstory that gets into the manuscript should be relevant to the scene and to the narrative and to pushing the plot forward. There's got to be a reason that it comes up. And third, this is sort of drafting advice. I think in drafting, especially your second draft, it's always better to tell than not. You were talking about going through the whole process of the arrest earlier from like a research standpoint, but I also think that's super valuable for an emotional standpoint. Like a lot of authors I see, sometimes they're skipping these emotionally important moments. Mm-hmm. They're not lingering in them and spending time with them. And that can really suck the life out of a manuscript. And and the fourth thing is sort of related to that it's better to tell than not. And that's that small stuff matters as much, if not more, than the big stuff sometimes. From thoughts and reflections on like another character says something and your character doesn't react to what they say at all, that's a missed opportunity sometimes. But not just that, but also like their actual actions. Like an example I use a lot is that like a character who runs a shop, if they're sulking behind the counter, they're going to be read a lot differently than a character who's standing in the middle of the floor greeting customers. And the way we read them affects how we view their actions through the whole course of the book. So small stuff matters as much as the big stuff. But yeah, I think like second draft, my biggest advice is that when you do your second draft, you should be going through and adding this extra character stuff. And you should go overboard because as an editor, I can tell you, it's a lot easier to cut unnecessary stuff than it is to ask you to add new material on a deadline. So that's my biggest advice. I mean, character development, I think, is honestly the most important because readers will forgive a lot of crap if they're wrapped up in the characters. So it's definitely not to be skimped on.
Something that I found personally that goes along with what you say is that sometimes we tend to want to stay away from certain scenes, writing certain scenes, just because they might be difficult. Mm-hmm. But it could have been just as easy for me to skip over that, like you were saying, and just take the easy route. But that's an emotionally important thing, like you were mentioning. That's a really important thing for this. This is probably the most significant thing that has ever happened to this woman in her entire life. She's a nun. How significant must this stuff be? And so, I'm not saying she didn't have a better, but she has probably a pretty stable life. Yeah. This has brought her out of the norm for her, and dealing with the situation and being thrust into this situation that she has never been exposed to is life-changing for her in more than one way. And so you have to, like what Kate was saying, you take those opportunities and you use them to propel the story even more. Make those scenes count. You put that work into it, make it count. Mm-hmm. So what about you, Jeffrey?
So, first, there's some very, very good points already made that I can definitely agree with as far as the details and the voicing. So to say something a little bit different, the advice that I would give then, other than following the advice already given, is treat your world like a character. Develop it, know what's out there, know that, writing in a small town in the Northeast is going to be totally different from writing in the South, is going to be totally different than writing in another country, is different from writing in another time. Do your research, not just on your characters, but how the world that they live in will affect them, will have an impact on what they do, where they came from. Like the YA novels that I'm writing in Seattle. I mean, the diversity of culture out here and the mix and the different languages, you can go 3 blocks and the main language that's being spoken on the streets can totally change. And that's extremely different than all the years I lived in the Midwest and, the moving 33 times in my life all around the United States and Canada. And, going with my dad and working in Mexico has given me, a look at all of these different cultures just within, this one landmass. and just seeing how different one is from another in the way characters speak, in the experiences, in the general stability a character might have come up with, in what they're familiar with, not familiar with, the local religion, who they're likely to hang out with.
Mm-hmm.
And all of that, your setting has an effect on your characters and totally changes their backstory, and be familiar with it, because it can tell you a lot about your characters, who they are, and what they're going to do in particular situations.
Completely agree. I actually lived in Mexico for about 6 months, and I lived in Costa Rica for a year. So I was a missionary kid. So I moved around a lot too when I was a teenager, but it did, give me a lot more rich experience, and you get to see things from so many different perspectives. People need to take themselves out of their box and put yourself in that character's box instead. Where are they? What is their life like?
Mm-hmm.
How they would react to each other. Very important. What about you, Kenya? Any advice?
Yes, I agree with what everyone else has said so far. My advice for those authors for using backstory, I would recommend to, probably like Kate said, use it sparingly, use it if it's necessary, and skip it if it doesn't advance the plot or if it's not needed, Those are really important things, because you don't want to stop the action and, lose the reader with something that's boring and unnecessary. So that would probably be the biggest piece of advice for me.
Yeah, balancing the fluff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's really crucial. Is it necessary? Is it something that you really need? Is it something you don't need? If it's something you need, why is it that you need it? How can you use it? How can you use it to the full potential? If you're going to bring something up, what can you use? How can you use it as the overall story instead of this one little scene?
And that's a great thing to discuss with your critique partners, and then your betas, and then later your editor. Like, that should be an ongoing discussion.
Yes.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Okay.
So anyway, if everybody would like to just kind of close out, we've got a couple more minutes. Basically, if you want to take about a minute and say anything you want to in closing to our readers, and maybe give a refresher on how to get in touch with you. Why don't we go ahead with you, Kate?
Okay. It's been super, super fun being on this panel. I love talking about backstory, and it's cool to meet other role players and stuff like that. That's fun. As far as my best way to get in touch with me is through Twitter or Facebook. You can also sign up for my newsletter. I send that out once a month. And now is kind of a good time to start following me on all those kinds of pages, because my fantasy novel's coming out in January, From Under the Mountain. And we are actually holding a Characters on the Catwalk high fantasy fashion show to celebrate the launch. So, we are creating the costumes and all that kind of stuff. I'm working with a designer here in Portland, and so we'll be sharing updates about that over the next couple of months here, and we will end up probably live streaming the event itself in January. And if you're following me, then you can know all of the details about that. So yeah, Twitter, Facebook, Kate Spivey, CaitSpivey. So that's me.
Sounds like a lot of fun.
It's so fun, but also stressful.
Unfortunately, my costumes are not quite as fun. I guess you got a nun costume, but that's not quite as fun. It's like
You're flying nun,
wings on her, I guess. She could be a fairy nun. Okay, Jeffrey.
Okay. Since I think I forgot to include the contact details at the start, I'm really easy to get a hold of. Jeffrey Cook or Jeffrey Cook -author on Facebook. Jeff Cook 74 at Twitter. Can also look both me and some of the other authors that I do a lot of conventions with and work with regularly at clockworkdragon.net. All one word. That is a coalition of 5 authors that do a lot of conventions and work together a lot. Or look up the Writer Punk Project at punkwriters.com. And we are just about to release our second charity anthology. So I hope people will be following that. It's going to a really good cause. And we will be doing an online release party over the weekend of December 1st. So,
Right around the corner.
yeah, coming up really quickly. Pretty exciting.
Mm-hmm. I bet.
And like I said, it does go to a good cause. I'm really looking forward to helping Paws out now that we've sponsored the Big Dog Kennel for a year. We're really hoping to double that and sponsor like a activity room and care room for the animals next year.
Hey, Kenya, go ahead, and if you would give your last thoughts.
Okay, yeah, you can find me on my website. If you go to knlee.com, you'll find links to my Twitter, Facebook, and all of my other social media. And you can also sign up for my mailing list directly on my website. I do have 2 releases in November, 1 in December, 1 in January, so it's a good time to, keep in touch with me. I respond very quickly on Facebook as well if you want to send me a message or anything. It was so much fun to meet all the other authors. I can't wait to look at your books. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you all.
Yay.
I really appreciate everybody joining us. My name again is Kimberly Brouillette for the virtual Fantasycon 2015. Hopefully we will make this an annual event. If everybody would be interested in participating in future events, just make sure that you get in touch with me. Again, you can email me at info@kimberlybrouillette.com, and that's Kimberly, Brouillette. And I know it's excessively long, but that's what I've got. So, but you can also get in touch with me on Twitter at WriteRightForYou, and you can also find me on Facebook. Usually you can find me on Facebook. I'm there most of the time. So if you want to get in touch with me, feel free. If you are interested, if you're another author and would be interested in joining future panels, feel free to contact me about that as well. We will be trying to post the information for each of the authors along with the information with the actual video when they are going to be posted. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me about that. Again, I'm Kimberly Brouillette, KimberlyBrouillette.com. And if you have any questions, feel free to contact me. Thank you all very much.
Yay, thank you.
Thank you.